Welcome back. This is the first lecture for Chapter 7, Listening. In Chapter 7, we're going to talk about the listening process. In this first lecture, we'll define listening, and then we will cover the different styles and types of listening. In the next lecture, the second lecture in the series, we'll talk about effectiveness in terms of listening and some common barriers to listening. So as we think about listening, we need to differentiate between hearing, which is the passive physiological process in which sound is received by the ear, and listening, which is the active process of making meaning out of another person's spoken message. When we are listening, we are engaging in an active process that is assigning meaning to what another person is saying. So this is a really important piece of that receiver component of the communication models, where we are decoding messages. And it's important to make the distinction between hearing and listening because we know that there are times when we hear something, but we aren't actively paying attention to what the other person is saying, and we're not really thinking about actively what the meaning of that message is. And so in that case, we're hearing the person, but we're not listening to the person. And so we can have hearing without listening, but we cannot have listening without hearing. And so when we think about how these two things are related, we know that listening is not a biological or natural process. It is a mindful behavior. It is something that is learned, so we can learn to be a better listener, and you read about some of that in your chapter today. We know that listening takes skill and practice. We learn from our communication mistakes about how to be a better listener, and some people can be better listeners than others. And so thinking about the difference between listening and hearing, again, we know that because listening is the active process of making meaning, that two people can hear the same message, but they can create meaning in different ways. So if we think about kind of the connotative meaning and the differences there, they can attribute very different things to the same message that they both heard. And so there's a little bit of variance in the listening process because of this meaning-making component. Therefore, listening really involves our perceptions, our experiences. It's based in kind of these cultural norms and behaviors. It's a way that helps us filter messages and, again, derive meaning. So meaning is really important here. When we think about listening, we can categorize listening behaviors in two ways. The first is through the types of listening. And so there's different reasons why we may listen to other people or engage in the listening process. We know that studies have shown that we spend a lot of time listening, especially college students. They spend roughly 50% of their time listening. And when you think about, talking to your friends, listening to music, watching TV, going to class, all of these behaviors involve the listening process. And so we can really break down those behaviors into these types of listening or reasons why we listen. The first reason why we may listen would be to gather information, and this would be informational listening. Here we're really listening to learn. We're listening for information. So when somebody is giving us directions or we're in class listening to our instructor before an exam, we're getting information that's going to be useful later. This is oftentimes the most passive form of listening and doesn't always require a really active engagement here. We also have critical listening, and this is listening to evaluate. Sometimes we need to listen to judge or analyze information. So if you are, kind of researching the best phone to buy, you may watch some YouTube tutorials. Oftentimes we are listening to evaluate when we are listening to kind of debates. So there's political debates happening right now. Most times in those in listening interactions, we're evaluating the information, how it relates to us. And this is oftentimes a more active form of listening. We're also getting information, but really at the top, highest level, we're getting the information and we're evaluating it, as opposed to just digesting it to learn something new. The third type of listening is empathetic listening. Empathetic listening occurs when we listen to what somebody else is experiencing, what they're going through. We're trying to understand that person's thoughts and feelings. A lot of times we're engaging in effective listening when we're comforting and supporting others, providing aid to a friend or family member. Empathetic listening is really important in our interpersonal relationships. And then we also have appreciative listening, which is the last type of listening. Appreciative listening is when we listen for pure enjoyment or pleasure. So when we're watching TV, when we are listening to music, oftentimes, we're getting new information, we're evaluating what we hear, maybe we're learning from it, but really it's just for the pleasure of having that information. We're not necessarily critiquing it. We're not necessarily learning information for an exam. And so thinking about just really appreciating or listening, piece of art, or listening for the pure enjoyment of that purpose. So when we think about these types of listening, there's no really piece of listening that's better than the other, but these are really kind of I call them the contexts in which we listen, the reasons for why we listen, maybe our motivations for listening. And the second way that we can think about listening or categorizing listening is through our preferred listening styles. And these are different than the situations that we listen in. So when we talk about types of listening, we're talking about reasons for listening. Listening styles are how we listen, okay? So thinking about the ways in which we listen. So those are the main distinction between these two ways in which we categorize listening. Listening types are situations, contexts, reasons why we're listening, and our listening styles are how we listen. And so when we think about listening styles, we're really thinking about being a people-oriented listener. We may prefer to listen and think about, the main way in which we listen to people is by thinking about and emphasizing concerns for others. So thinking about emphasizing and really paying attention to how the person is feeling, what their interests are, what their emotions are, what their kind of thought process is. So really thinking about when we're comforting somebody, or even maybe when we're listening to an ad on the radio, really focusing on it and paying attention to those more emotionally expressive kinds of messages. Action-oriented listening involves emphasizing organization and precision. So people who are action-oriented listeners, they very much value messages that are organized, they're clear, they're concise, they're neat, they're error-free. And so when we think about preparing messages for action-oriented listeners, or when we think about messages that we prefer, if you're score high in action-oriented listening, then this would involve kind of the organization and precision of the message. We also know that people can value content or emphasizing intellectual challenges when they are communicating with others. So thinking about content-oriented listeners as really paying attention to the details of the message, maybe engaging in kind of evaluating and judging those messages more than others, really thinking things through, planning, plotting. That would be fall under this preferred kind of content-oriented listening style. And the last one is time-oriented listening. And time-oriented listening really prefers efficiency over other things. So time-oriented listeners prefer quick messages that get to the point, the conversation, don't drag on, not a lot of vivid language here. So really thinking about efficiency in terms of communicating with others. So when we think about these preferred listening styles, there's really no one style that's better than the other. But again, we have these preferred ways in which we listen, and when we think about effectiveness, which will be really the center of the next lecture, we know that we can adapt our listening styles to different situations. So really effective communicators are able to adjust their listening style based on the situation of the interaction that they're in. But we always still kind of have this default, this preferred way that we choose to hear and listen and attend to and assign meaning to messages that fall into one of these clear categories. And so what I would like for you to do, before listening to your next lecture, perhaps, these can be done before listening to your next lecture, I guess what I'm trying to say, is that I want you to complete your individual assignment, which is essentially, this is similar to the communication competence questionnaire that I had you fill out. It's a questionnaire that's going to help you determine what your preferred listening style is. So there's 16 questions, statements I'd like you to rate, whether you experience this always or never. Again, that's in the instructions. And then you're going to tally up and score your questionnaire, your responses, to determine whether you score highest in action, content, people, or time-oriented listening. And then we're going to take that style and we're going to use that listening style for the class discussion, where you will engage in an activity where you're really going to think about preparing a message for your specific listening style. And so I'm going to, once you've done the individual assignment, then you can move on and do the class discussion for this chapter. So these two things are related, and you have to complete your individual assignment before you complete your class discussion. And then you can go on and talk about and listen to the second lecture in the series, which would be the last lecture for the first half of the semester, on listening effectiveness.